Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our Gatty lecture. We are beginning today's very exciting lecture by Professor Eric Charles Thompson. So it is very great to see you all here today. I'm very excited to introduce our speaker today, Eric C. Thompson. Eric is an expert on social cultural anthropologies and Southeast Asian studies. He holds a PhD in social cultural anthropology from the University of Washington and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Center of Southeast Asian Studies, University of California, Los Angeles, South Asian Studies. Now he's an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the National University of Singapore. Eric is very productive and wrote many wonderful books like Unsettling Absences, Urbanism in Rural Malaysia, and The Story of Southeast Asia. He is also the co-author of Awareness and Attitudes Towards ASEAN and Do Young People Know ASEAN, as well co-editor of Southeast Asian Anthropologies and Asian Smallholders, Persistence and Transformation. This year, Eric also have a new book published by National University of Singapore Press, The Story of Southeast Asia. And it's very lucky that we actually have a field copy brought by Eric today. So if anyone is interested in it, please come towards us and you can have a copy of it. Yay. In today's talk, Eric will share insights from his latest work, diving into the narrative of Southeast Asia through the lens of historical anthropology. Without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Eric C. Thompson.
Hey, thank you very much for the introduction. As advertised, what I'm going to do today is to talk about the book that I've recently published. So it came out just in March with NUS Press. I have, like, as was mentioned, I have a few copies available here with me. It's also being distributed by University of Chicago Press, and they gave me this QR code. So if you want to purchase it at a discount, you can scan that, and I'll put it up again later at the end of the talk. So if you're still interested in the book at that point. So I'm gonna basically talk about the book. But I'll begin with talking about how there are a lot of other books like this one, right? There are a number of comparative titles which do very similar sorts of things. Mostly these are histories of Southeast Asia. So just to mention a few of the more prominent ones, you have Milton Osborne's Southeast Asia: An Introductory History, which I really need to look this up. I believe it was first published in the late 70s, and it's now in its 13th or 14th or 15th a republished edition. So it's like you can still find it available up till this point. I think it's been updated a little bit, over the years, although it's still substantially the same book that it was when it was first published. A couple others that I'll mention too, which actually Craig Lockhart's Southeast Asia and World History, and then Rick Cliff's and others' New History of Southeast Asia. Those both actually were published in the period since I started conceiving the book that I wrote. I would say of all the books that exist, Craig Lockhart's is the most similar to mine. I think it's a very good comparative title to look at. I think it's excellent. And in fact, to be perfectly honest, it came out in 2010, and I first started conceiving this project in 2009. And then his book came out, and I read it, and I'm like, oh, well, he just did what I was thinking of doing. So, but not exactly. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then, other people probably all know the emergence of modern Southeast Asia, which is an update of the very famous text In Search of Southeast Asia, which is, at least when I was a graduate student in the early 1990s, that was the main text. You have to read this book if you're going to work on Southeast Asia, sort of as a regional text. But I want to talk about some of the ways in which what I've written is a little bit different than those, and also some of the motivations and reasons for writing this book. And also what I'm going to talk about is some of the arguments in the book itself. So first of all, it is organized chronologically, but also thematically. So I think one of the things that makes the perspective in this book a little bit different is that I am an anthropologist, trained as an anthropologist, right? With a great respect for history, but I'm not a historian. So other books, I mean, Craig and others, Rick Cliffs and others are historians, and so write in a more historical mode. So in a certain sense, you might say that other books have a stronger focus on chronology, right? As history famously being one darn thing after another, right? Whereas this book, what I'm really focusing on is various themes that led to the development of the creating of Southeast Asia as we know it today. So each theme, the first three, for example, really you could even, I've given them a slightly nicer, more interesting names, but you could basically say chapter 1 is demography, chapter 2 is economy and industry, and chapter 3 is politics. So like those are sort of major themes of those. Then talking about religion, about gender and family, about identities, particularly what we think of today as ethnic and racial identities and national identities. And then in the last two chapters, a chapter on contesting sovereignty, which returns us to issues of power. And then finally, modernity and modern Southeast Asia. So each of those is a theme where obviously these themes like the, economic relations or gender are things that go throughout history. I mean, they don't really have a starting and ending point. But the reason, what I've done here is to kind of emphasize and talk about them at particular moments in time when I'm basically making arguments that substantial transformations or changes or things were developed in those particular periods, which then have important implications up until the present in terms of how Southeast Asia operates as a region. So what I'll mention here too is sort of a number of highlights of the book, and then I'll come back to and talk about these in a little bit more detailed, give a little more detailed explanation of them as I go along. But the first is to say that for this book, I've really focused on a regional perspective. So this is really a book about Southeast Asia as a region. And so if you look at other books, like if you look at, I think Osborne's book or other books in this genre, Craig Lockhart's book actually does do that to a similar extent that I do of maintaining a regional focus. But there's certain narrative, there's one particular narrative that I'm kind of writing against in this book. And that's the narrative structure which looks at Southeast Asia as a region up until the point when Europeans enter the scene. And then all of a sudden it becomes separate colonial enterprises and then separate national histories. So if you look at, for example, I mentioned there's a book by Church earlier, which is just a separate, which has each nation as it talks about Southeast Asia, basically each chapter being one nation of Southeast Asia. So a chapter on Brunei, a chapter on Malaysia, et cetera, right? So I have that regional perspective because I'm really making an argument about the region as a place, right? It's also, I have what I talk about as a deep sort of historical anthropological view of how the region has come to be a region, right? And then also two interrelated themes, which I talk about centering Southeast Asian agency. So focusing on what people within Southeast Asia are doing as the major sort of agents of creating the region as we know it today. And also to sort of in a, playing around with this phrase a little bit, but putting colonialism in its place in that the major narrative that's sort of been shaped in the 20th century, I believe, or one major narrative, is the kind of idea that Europeans kind of came into Southeast Asia, wiped out everything that was there, created modern Southeast Asia, and then left, and sort of Southeast Asians then had to sort of deal with all these European institutions that were just like left over from the Europeans. So the sort of idea that, Southeast Asia is a colonial invention is something I'm basically writing against in this book. As I mentioned already, I have this thematic chronological structure, and so I have a number of arguments that I'll talk about in a little more detail in terms of religious transformation, gender modernity, ethnic identities, and also Southeast Asian agency. But also in writing this book, when I first conceived it, like I said, I was on a sabbatical, and I'd been doing a lot of research about about ASEAN. I've been doing some collaboration with the ASEAN Foundation, some of my own research, using some very old school anthropological methods to think about how people cognitively think about ASEAN as a region and as more specifically a semantic domain. But I had all of this data, and my original idea of my sabbatical was I would go on sabbatical, I would sort of pull all this together and put it all into a book. And then as I worked on it and thought about it, first of all, I was like, well, this will be all very interesting. I've kind of put some of this in articles already, and maybe 3 people will read it, right? So that was one of my sort of motivations for thinking about it. But the other thing was the ways in which I sort of was dissatisfied with the existing books that in this genre, right? And I'll talk about that in more detail. But when writing it too, I've tried to focus on or think throughout about, what is one's audience, right? Who is one writing for? And what I've tried to do in this book is to really write it for Southeast Asians. So what that means is, among other things, like writing for a readerly public in Southeast Asia, but also for this sort of general audience, or the way you talk to university presses about this is it's an undergraduate, pitching it to undergraduates, right? Meaning like avoiding a book that is overly complex, overly jargonistic, etc. But also in that what I'm going to do today is kind of lay out the arguments I'm making in the book. But the book is not an argumentative book. I don't go through and talk about all the debates and so said this and this other person said this and this is this piece of evidence that supports or goes against it. So I've written it as sort of one relatively clear, clean narrative about the construction of Southeast Asia, of course, drawing on various scholars and from time to time noting that many of the things that I'm arguing in this book are still topics of hot debate within scholarship, right? But it's not, one way to put it is that it's not written specifically for, undergraduates at Cornell. It's written for undergraduates at University of Indonesia or Chulalongkorn University and so forth, right? So as I said, right, part of my motivation coming out of this was that I have been working on these ideas of ASEAN awareness, values, and identity, working with the ASEAN Foundation. And if anything, this is, I have this, to be very transparent, I have this ongoing collaborative relationship, or I've had an ongoing collaborative relationship with ASEAN Foundation, with the ASEAN Secretariat. And part of the motivation is that this is the kind of work that the ASEAN Foundation is trying to do, is trying to think about what is Southeast Asia and how do we think about it as a region and a body. And also, they have themselves a kind of consciousness raising agenda to get people within ASEAN to think more of themselves as like not only being Thai or Indonesian or Lao or whatever, but also to think in terms of kind of regional consciousness in a certain way. And so in certain ways, this book fits into that kind of agenda, so to speak, right? And also in Southeast Asian studies, that I come out of a Southeast Asian studies background. So that's part of the thing that I happen to have been trained at University of Washington, right? And well, spent one summer here way back when Siasi was at Cornell in 1991. So I spent a really nice summer here, which by all accounts, I believe is the best time to be in Cornell, right? So I had this a certain kind of training and a certain kind of background, which, allowed me to think about writing a book like this. So the first point to make is that I was focusing on this deep history. So the first 3 chapters in particular, you can think of them as sort of setting up a regional frame of reference, right? And writing in a way in relationship to other kinds of narratives, which of course there are colonial and colonial era histories of Southeast Asia, right? But then there are many, many individual national narratives, which people write national histories. And the point of a national history is part of the point is to sort of give people a sense of what is this nation and how does one fit into or relate to the nation. And then, of course, you have regional histories. But as I said, where you have regional histories, you have things like Church's short history, which is just 11 national histories all put together. And then authors like Owen, in the Southeast Asia New History. So Owen's modern Southeast Asia is really focuses on the 18th century onward, right? I mean, it sort of deals very, very briefly. A lot of these histories deal very, very briefly with everything that came before Europeans came on the scene, but then focus really on the modern era. And so what I do in the first 3 chapters especially is talk about sort of the very earliest settlement of Southeast Asia, the way that trade networks emerged in Southeast Asia, and then of course the early states of Southeast Asia. And in writing the book in general, I was guided by something that really struck me when I was a graduate student, which I think all of us have those experiences of reading certain things that just stick with you over time, right? And this was reading Ernesto Laclau's work, and where he talks about, he has just a phrase, I think it's in the new revolution of our time, right? Where he talks about social structures being objective realities composed of sediments laid down by the historical choices of subjective actors. So in thinking about that in some ways is guiding my thinking of this book, of thinking the way that, there's sort of settlement, trade, the certain kind of political ideology of the early kingdoms and states, and then, ways in which people have created, adopted world religions, managed family and gender relationships, developed ideas of ethnic identity and so forth. And so all of those are sort of accretions over time, which are these sort of deep structures that create the region as we know it today. So in some of the individual chapters, again, there are certain kinds of arguments that I'm making about why and why to think about particular topics in particular periods, right? So in chapter 4, for example, I call it power, piety, and reformation. And in a kind of an allusion to Victor Lieberman, obviously, right? I talk about the strange parallels between Theravada, Islam, and then also Confucianism, Christianity. Because one of the ways when we think about the diversity of Southeast Asia, when people say, oh, it's such a diverse region, one of the major ways in which it's diverse is there are so many different religions. I mean, there's also, these are all or some of the major, whether you want to, I tend to call them popular religions, but popular world religions, etc., right, are Theravada Buddhism, Islam, and Confucianism, Christianity. There are, of course, still indigenous religious traditions, and there are many other religious traditions, and things like Cao Dai in Vietnam and so forth. So there are many religious traditions, but it's really the argument of this particular chapter is that there's this period very, very, very roughly between about 1000 CE and 1500 CE, which is treated in many of the standard narratives and texts of Southeast Asia as a kind of in-between period, right? This is where, classical Savanabhumi Southeast Asia kind of collapses or fades away or disappears, right? So it's the early part of this area is the kind of the end of Angkor and the end of Bagan and so forth, right? And then you get, of course, Tony Reed and Barbara Ndaya and Leonard Ndaya and other people who focus on the early modern Southeast Asia up until then presaging the present. But the early modern sort of starts around 1400. And so this is sort of this in-between period. And in some ways, I think the kind of the ways in which this era produced the religious diversity of Southeast Asia is somewhat obscured because of that kind of narrative structure. And in addition to which, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but when I was first thinking about this, or when I started thinking about this, you start off thinking that, oh, there are these like incredibly different religious traditions. Like in the maritime world, you get the spread of Islam. In the mainland, you get the spread of Theravada. Of course, in the places influenced by Vietnamese expansion, you get Confucianism. And then later on, you kind of get Christianity being adopted, usually in the places where Islam or Theravada or Confucianism were not already powerful religions, right? Whether it's in the highlands areas of Southeast Asia, or whether it's in island areas, or like the Philippines, where there wasn't yet the spread of significantly of Theravada or especially of Islam, right? You get Christianity, so that's a later thing. But what I talk about in this text, though, is the way in which I think there are things going on with that spread, which are particularly happening in this period, where and also the reason for talking about them and thinking about them as being popular religions. One of the things that's going on in this period is that you're getting larger and larger societies, which are, in which traditional ways of organizing and running and ruling those societies are not as effective, in part simply because they are so large. And so one of the things that all of these have in common with Theravada Islam and Confucianism and Christianity is that they kind of tie people to these larger communities and larger societies at a very individual level. So before this period, you have I tended to just talk about it as the Savannah Bhumi period, right? The era of the golden lands, their era of where other people use the term, well, I also use the term, the Sanskrit cosmopolis, the period when Sanskrit was a major influence throughout the region. In that period, you had obviously the spread of sometimes people call it Hindu Buddhism, or I tend to use Brahmin Buddhism, right? You have the spread of Brahmin Buddhism throughout, and you find that in Cambodia and Sumatra and Java and all over the place, obviously in Bagan, in Burma, so forth. So you have that spreads everywhere. But that is very much a kind of elite-focused religious, cosmological, and also kind of political ideology. In other words, it very much affects the rulers, a certain set of people who are kings and rajas and also priests and so forth. But it doesn't too much sink down into sort of popular folk everyday life. For the most part, people continue to practice their own localized forms of spirituality and religion, and are not. It doesn't majorly transform people's like worldview and cosmology. When these come in a certain sense, they challenge the elite sort of ideology of the Sanskrit Brahmanism, because what all of these do is have an idea that it ties people, and it makes personal piety important to one's salvation, and ties people in a more personalized way to kind of the larger society and community, right? So anyway, and I think there's a lot more work that can be done there, including work that might say that I'm completely wrong about this, but that's part of what I'm hoping for with this book, is that people can sort of take the kind of arguments that I made and the framework I've laid out, and either look into this more deeply and sort of like, I think there's much more to be said about and thought about the extent to like, why is it that these religions spread at the time they did under the circumstances that they did, right? The next, in chapter 5, then, I talk about modernity and gender relations, and specifically talk about kinship and gender. And here, to be, again, very, very transparent, this was the last chapter that I conceptualized. I sort of had all of the other chapters, but in other aspects of my life, I'm a gender studies scholar. And I'm like, and I know that there's all this like fantastically good and important work by people like Barbara Andaya, Michael Peltz, many, many others, right? Where there's a story here about gender being an important issue, and also kinship being an important issue in Southeast Asia. And it took me a while, though, to figure out like, where does this sort of fit in the story I'm telling? So where I focus on this, though, is really the story of what happens with modernity and gender relations. So one of the things that happens is, and also a way in which, obviously still, but even more to extent in earlier historic periods, right? Kinship relations are very important. In fact, arguably, in a kind of as an anthropologist, putting on my anthropology hat, right? In smaller scale societies, kinship tends to be kind of everything. Like who you are is who you're related to through marriage and or through descent, through birth, right? And like these more modern notions that we have, like of ethnic identity or of like large scale world religious identity and certainly national identity. I mean, none of those things, I mean, in many societies, those don't even exist, but kinship is extremely important. But what happens, I mean, and again, it happens in many places in the world, but specifically in Southeast Asia, you get with modernity from wherever you want to mark that, say 1400 or something, with the early modern period up until the present, what you get is a kind of undermining of the kinds of structures that created egalitarian societies, right? So especially you have with kinship societies, famously, the most common kinds of kinship society, right, is a bilateral one where you figure descent through both men and women, but through fathers and mothers, right? And also many societies that have matrilineal traditions of one kind or another. And so in those kinds of societies, and what you don't, well, you also, so Southeast Asia has everything. So you also have some patrilineal societies, right? But those don't be so dominant. In contrast, right, all of the societies that are interacting with Southeast Asia from earlier times, but especially from, say, the 1400s, 1500s onward, with East Asian societies, Chinese society, Japanese society, definitely European societies, but also Middle Eastern societies, South Asian societies. These are all extremely patrilineal, patriarchal societies. So there are important effects of how people from those societies, mainly men from those societies, were coming into Southeast Asia, right, interacting with people, and on the one hand, being shocked, completely shocked at how women were so autonomous and powerful and controlling the marketplace on the one hand, but then on the other hand, in some of their own interactions, kind of propping up masculine authority and masculine power, right, in interactions with Southeast Asia. But also importantly, and maybe even more importantly, is a certain set of masculine biases of modern institutions. So you get, because in part, the status of women in Southeast Asia was very propped up by the particular kinship arrangements that people had. But as you get modern institutions, which are essentially non-kin based, right, forms of social organization, those tended to favor, whether it was, again, things like the Buddhist Sangha, or in the Muslim world, the importance of the mosque and the imams and ustazes and so forth, right? So those are religious examples, but then also increasingly during this period, you're getting larger scale states, so bureaucracies which tend to have male biases, you're getting armies which tend to have male biases, and you also get certain kinds of economic systems which tend to have some male biases. Those probably maybe the least, but anyway, so when we look at gender relations, so one of the things I point out here is that I think there's a story that that we have of gender relations and modernity, and it's a story of kind of emancipation, that modernity has emancipated women in particular, and then also LGBTQ identifying individuals and so forth, from traditionally patriarchal social structures, right? But that's a story that's told from the history of, first and foremost, the history of Europe and European colonial settler societies like the United States, and then also secondarily from the histories of East Asia and South Asia and Middle East, which are all, again, stories of and what makes these all similar is the big story is that you go from societies that are overwhelmingly organized around kinship to societies that are not organized around kinship. Now, if your kinship system is a very patriarchal kinship system, it's a story of emancipation. But if your kinship system is one that really promotes certain status for women, and especially for mothers, and also in doing that creates egalitarian gender relationships, the story of like modernity is one of like losing some of that status, right? So that's the big picture of what I'm doing in that chapter. So then also in chapter 6 here, I call it emergent identities. And really the focus here is on trying to think about all of the ways, again, in a deep historical perspective, all of the ways in which the elements of what we now think of as ethnicity and or race were developed in Southeast Asia in particular ways, right? So you have, of course, language and lineage, right? That Southeast Asia, famously, there are several thousand languages in Southeast Asia. There are, of course, many lineages. I mean, language and lineage are sort of a way in which, well, if you take language more broadly as culture, right? Language and lineage are basically ethnicity and race, right? Those are the major markers of ethnicity, and the marker of race is like how you are part of some mysterious biological group. But neither of those work in terms of, you know, if you look at, say, language and identity, right? If you take Austroasiatic languages, right? Vietnamese, Khmer, and Mon, and Aslian languages in like the Orang Asli languages of Malaysia are all Austroasiatic. But I don't think any people in those groups think of themselves as one group of people in any sort of way, right? You also have, of course, a lot of movement and migration. You have a history of creating status organized societies of sort of patron-client type relationships of obligation and servitude. And also you have many societies which, many instances where people were related to each other through trade. And there's a very interesting story. I mean, you can find this in many places, but the best example is on the Straits of Malacca. And this is very much Leonard Andaya's work, right? Which is talking about the ways in which you get different groups of people thinking of themselves as different, but also interrelated. In that interrelationship, there's no motivation for assimilation. In fact, you want people to all remain distinctive, because if you take sort of, for example, you take the typical Malay trading state like Malacca, right? The Malays were sort of running the port. The Orang Laut were essentially like the navy for the port, and then the Orang Asli, or people living inland, sometimes operated as soldiers on land as a defense force, but also were harvesting things from the forests, right, to bring down to the port. Similarly, you have the sort of whole relationship between Minangkabau in the highlands and the Malays in the lowlands, and trading back and forth. So there are lots of cases where people kind of recognize difference, but sort of there was the incentive to kind of maintain that difference. You don't want to assimilate everybody, because everybody has their own sort of place in these sets of relationships, right? And then also talking about this idea of becoming indigenous, the ways in which so many people over time have developed, and I emphasize here, talk a lot about the term peranakan, which is a Malay Indonesian term, right? And as far as I tell, and I'm still trying to find a linguist to verify this completely, but in my own basic understanding of bahasa, peranakan, anak is the root, right? Anak, a child. And so peranakan is the process of becoming a child of a place, basically, right? So it's sort of becoming indigenous. And you have many, many peranakan communities in Southeast Asia, whether those are, you know, Chinese or Arab or Eurasian Or also within Southeast Asia itself, you have Bugis Peranakan communities, because the Bugis are traveling all over the place and settling and sort of becoming indigenous in various places, right? And then finally, of course, you have colonial classifications. And there is a way in which the colonial projects hardened kind of senses of, and brought in concepts of race, right? And hardened senses of boundaries and so forth. But those were sort of built upon all of these things that had gone before. And so the current, the part of the argument simply here is that the modern way in which people think about ethnicity and race is not just sort of a natural occurring thing in the world. It's something that's sort of a way of thinking about diversity and difference that's really just been developed in the last couple hundred years and did not really exist in the past in the same way. Right. Then the final couple of chapters, one is on contested sovereignty, and the other is on modern Southeast Asia. And in these chapters, I'm thinking both about thinking about the colonial period, well, especially in chapter 7. You could say chapter 7 could be a chapter that basically is the colonial period. But I have written about it and thought about it as a period of contested sovereignty, because this is the period when you are getting larger states, kingdoms within Southeast Asia. And this is a particular period where, for example, the Thais and the Burmese are always going at each other, but also, and the Vietnamese are expanding down south through the sort of period of expansion into southern parts of what's now, Vietnam, what's southern Vietnam now. And so there's lots of contestation of sovereignty. And if you do pay attention to Europeans during this period, in most places through most of the period, Europeans were sort of entering into these sovereignty contests and sort of getting themselves involved in these contests of sovereignty. But it was really not for most of for most of Southeast Asia, it's really not until the late 1800s, until 1940, where you get, what we think of as high colonialism, really colonial domination in most places. Now, there are places like, my mouth was getting ahead of me and saying the Philippines. The Philippines is a case, right? And a few other places where you get, much longer periods of kind of European dominance in the colonial period. But also, really thinking about this period too, I mean, whether it's the 400-year period or thinking about the 80-year period, right? That during this period, people within Southeast Asia are not sort of merely passive victims of what's going on. People are always, of course, responding to this. And in sort of the high colonial period, what Southeast Asians are doing is starting to, among other things, but pulling on various ideas that are all new in the world, and they're equally new in Europe, right? But things like the nation state and things like the idea of national sovereignty or people's like self-determination, and drawing on those kinds of ideas to adapt them, as they've done with Sanskrit and other things, adapt them to local circumstances, and ultimately use them as an ideological basis for overthrowing the colonial domination, right? And then finally, talking about sort of modern Southeast Asia and thinking about what modernity is. One thing I do lay out in a bit of an argument in the text is to say that, we think about, when people talk about modernity, I think there are two kind of arguments for what is modernity. What do we mean when we say what is the modern, right? One of those is thinking of modernity as something basically invented by Europeans, right? So there's a story that modernity is a bunch of things that happen in Europe, and then ideas that develop in Europe, maybe first with the Treaty of Westphalia, and the sort of which develops into the modern nation state, And then also the European Enlightenment, which, you know, emphasizes a kind of scientific view of the world, and then starts coming up with ideas like race as a way to think about human diversity and so forth. So there are these European ideas that get developed in Europe, and then they're kind of spread to the rest of the world, and everybody else adopts them. And that modernity is kind of a European invention, right? Now, that's not entirely untrue, but there's another way to think about what modernity is, and this is both what I tend to focus on, emphasize in the book, and also what I myself believe to be the case, is that really what we have with modernity is the easiest way for me as an anthropologist to think of it is it's a transition akin to the agricultural revolution of 10,000 years ago, right? When previously everyone lived as a forager or a hunter and gatherer, and it was only very roughly 10,000-ish years ago, 12,000, wherever you want to count it. But it was about 10,000 years ago where people started to live in agricultural societies, and agriculture brought with it major transformations in the ways that we lived in the world. Well, about 200 years ago, we have transitioned into an urban industrial societies, right? And that's been a kind of, just like the agricultural revolution, ultimately is kind of a worldwide phenomenon. This is similarly a worldwide phenomenon where people are becoming sort of more, so the economies have shifted to being not based on agricultural production, but based more and more on industrial production and also kind of services now as well. And then also just simply that people are living overwhelmingly in urban places. I think Southeast Asia is now more than 50%, like the rest of the world, is more than 50% urban, right? The people mostly live in cities, right? So view, again, like especially in the chapter 8, I sort of talk about how those transformations have taken place in Southeast Asia and what has followed from this sort of different way of living in and organizing society. So I'll just a couple more minutes here, I'll wrap up so we can have some discussion. But there is, of course, I just want to point out, and everybody here should know this to a certainty, that all of this is up for debate. So there are many, many, many ongoing debates about you know, how to think about Southeast Asia, how to think about Southeast Asian societies and so forth, right? I mean, I've mentioned already some to do with like thinking about gender and modernity, thinking about what is ethnicity and race. But then there are also these very, very classic questions in Southeast Asian history, like what is Sriwijaya? There's been some recent writing by Liam, guy who's based in Brunei, trying to write. It's another version of like Sriwijaya wasn't really in Sumatra, it was actually in Angkor, and using all of the Chinese texts to make that case. I think that the problem with the argument is that that particular version of the argument is focusing on how do we interpret the Chinese texts, but ignoring the fact that you have inscriptions in stone in Sumatra saying like Sriwijaya. So anyway, but another, and this is probably one of the things that I kind of learned and found quite interesting. There's this one case I'll say, and I think I think this is again still not like settled, but I'll tell the story that as I understand it now is an interesting case about Champa or the Cham, right, in southern what's now southern Vietnam, right? That, I mean, Cham society, Cham is a language, it's a Malay language. And it's apparently linguistically most closely related to Achinese linguistically, which is anyway interesting. But it's always been the standard story about Cham and Champa was that there's at some point you had a sort of migration from the Austronesian world, the sort of island Southeast Asia migration to the mainland, right? And then the Cham were Austronesians who settled on the mainland. Well, what's very interesting, because it's very new kind of data that we have, is the DNA data, right? DNA tracing lineages, tracing biological lineages. And it turns out from that sort of genetic testing that Cham are primarily biologically related to Khmer and Vietnamese and Viet, right, groups. There's only a very small amount of the kind of genetic mixture in Cham populations, which can be traced to island Southeast Asia. And that is very, very much a patrilineal genetic lineage. In other words, it comes from fathers or men, right? So what that would seem to indicate is that what you had Mon Khmer speaking people, Austroasiatic speaking people on the coast of Vietnam who had trade relationships with the islands, and that there were significant numbers. And I'm guessing, I'm just here, this is a pure guess, which in fancy terms we call it a hypothesis, right? But anyway, a pure guess is that this may have been very much in the Sriwijaya era, which is during the period of the Sanskrit cosmopolis and the influence of Brahmin Buddhism, and when these ideas of how to form kingdoms were spreading, right? That is maybe during the Sriwijaya period that you had a particular sort of influx of people from the men from the islands coming and marrying into local elites, which is what most people did. I mean, before the Europeans came, if you wanted to be politically powerful, you didn't come and try to take over everything. What you did is come to Southeast Asia and marry into prominent, important families, right? That's what Arabs did. That's what Chinese did. That's what everybody else did. So probably men from the sort of Sriwijaya sphere of influence were traveling there and becoming very prominent, to the point that people started using Malay because that was the kind of language of power, right? So you had Sanskrit, but you also had the use of Malay. And so it's sort of, so what in linguistic terms, this is a case of what's called language shift. So people the people shifted from using some kind of Mon Khmer to using Malay, right? But the people themselves, right, were sort of descended from neighboring, were closely related to their neighbors and were Mon Khmer. They weren't, it wasn't sort of a colonization from the islands that occurred in that way. Now, again, like I said, that's a hypothesis and one of many, many, many things that continue to be up for debate and up for everybody in this room to go work on and learn more about. Okay. So I'll end the talk there and then leave time for some discussion, question and answer. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess many of us have questions, Q&A section, open to the comments.
Great, this is so exciting to read. I'm looking forward to buying it and maybe assigning it and spending some time reading it.
Sure.
And so I have 1,000 questions. I want to know about everything that you've talked about. I want to talk about yours, the Dayak languages, the idea of the reverse migration to Borneo from the mainland by Austroasiatic speakers in the major desert. But that's not my question.
Oh, okay. I was going to say that's not my specialty either, but yeah. But no, yeah.
So
I will say, there's lots of evidence that there's just lots and lots of evidence that there's long-standing relationships between the islands and the mainland, right? You have the Sahun culture, I think it's pronounced, and so it's not so. So I think there were trade relationships going on long before Sriwijaya period, but I'm guessing just because of the way you find influence of Sanskrit culture and development of states elsewhere, that may have been the period when. I think that's an interesting question. If it is the case that language shifted and people, Cham started speaking Malay instead of Mon Khmer, when did that happen? And we don't know that. Yeah. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah. I want to ask about at the highest level, how do you think about the work that your book is doing in making Southeast Asia into the thing which you were then describing? So right. I'm very sympathetic to the idea that a book like this needs to exist and that an account of this form is worthwhile. I am very interested in particular in the idea of a non-national specific history of the region, not one which is designed to reproduce colonial Western obsessions with itself.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really provocative, and I think it's going to be interesting.
Yeah.
I'm curious how you think about the limits and boundaries of that style of argument.
Mm.
Like, so how far do you range into southern China? How far do you range into Papua?
Yeah.
How far do you range into the Himalayas? So
Right.
there's so many things
Yeah.
that so like at some point you have to draw a line. It's this part of the world, not that part of the world.
Yeah.
How do you go about drawing that line? And isn't it interesting that you may have drawn the line where the Europeans drew it?
Yeah. I mean, so I'm sort of drawing the line where ASEAN draws it. But of course, I mean, so this, I mean, one of the things you're getting at, I think, is this idea that, almost every book like this spends a long time at the beginning sort of hand-wringing over whether Southeast Asia is really a region, right? And yeah. And so, so actually that's, okay. First of all, I'll say about that, that's again, one of actually maybe the biggest argument of the whole book is to say that, insofar as anywhere is a region, insofar as Europe or East Asia, or I don't know, maybe Africa, maybe the Middle East, whatever, as far as anything at all is a region, right? Southeast Asia is a region. But the reason, to me, I think that part of the reason for that hand-wringing is because what people, the prototype that people have of regions are, in fact, some that I mentioned, like Europe, especially I point to Europe, East Asia, South Asia, Middle East. And if you look at all of those, actually South Asia is the one I'm maybe the shakiest on in this terms, but if you look at those, when they're thought about as regions, in a certain way, the reason that they're thought about as region is because of long-standing historical processes that were centralizing and homogenizing. So with East Asia, it's Chinese characters and Confucian thought and similar kind of Chinese thought and so forth in the way in which those get adopted and then shared by a large group of people. In Europe, it's kind of the Roman Empire and Christianity, right? In the Middle East, it's Islam and caliphates, right? So all of those have these kind of like homogenizing effect to create the region. The processes that create Southeast Asia are, if I'm going to make the strongest statement of this argument, is these are diversifying processes. They're not homogenizing processes, but they're the fact that you get, because, I mean, and it goes back to this thing of it being, a hub of the world, where there's so much like trade and people and ideas flowing through the region constantly, right? And so many people kind of moving around the region in different ways. And I mean, you get periods where something like Sanskrit becomes kind of very widely important, or our current moment where English is the lingua franca, but I mean, it's sort of English is the lingua franca of the world at the moment, right? But you have these processes which are, what it creates is a region of the world in which people are constantly dealing with diversity and difference, right? And so that sort of becomes what it kind of means to be part of that region, right? Now, whether, I mean, is Southeast Asia, and so those processes sort of define what Southeast Asia is. I mean, could you go up into Yunnan and say, yes, things are kind of like more like Southeast Asia than they are like China? You can make those kind of arguments, right? But also, when people sort of say, is Southeast Asia really a region, right? Every region of the world, every nation state of the world is a human social cultural creation. These are all, if you want to do the Ben Anderson, these are all imagined communities. They're all, but they're not imagined like fictional. They're things that we imagine and then have real effects and are real things in our societies. Yeah. So anyway, that.
just curious when you, I'm sure, and this is such a complicated thing.
Yeah.
I'm sure you had sleepless nights thinking about how to organize it.
Yeah.
I'm just struck by why does gender come so late? Like,
Yeah.
since you're an anthropologist and kinship is so important, it seems to me, do you build bridges between the chapters? Do the chapters speak back to one another? It just seems to me to start gender there.
Yeah.
For me, that would be a nightmare, but I admire you.
Well,
Selecting chapters in the order.
no, I mean, I sort of had literally mapped out and kind of written at least early drafts, right, of all of the other 7 chapters. And yeah, I don't, it was like, no, this is missing. This is really, really important. But like, how do I think about it? And also, how do I, like you said, I mean, where do kinship relationships start? I mean, obviously they start at the beginning of time, right? But then to be honest, I don't recall in great detail the how it kind of came to me or what I mean, but I think it was in the light of, I mean, it's obviously in the light of thinking about, again, I'm just name checking a couple people, but Endaya's work, right, and Peltz's work on gender pluralism, and many other people, right, and all. So it finally struck me that, I mean, there's a useful and significant important story to tell specifically about kinship and gender that can be sort of put chronologically into this sequence in the kind of very early modern period, and also kind of in wake of, I don't want to, I both think it is incorrect and also in other ways problematic to, I mean, the chapter on the religious change, right, is followed by the chapter on gender. I don't think that it was just the adoption of world religions that influenced gender, but the adoption of world religions was part of the process of greater modernity, and also all of these, whether it's Buddhism or Hinduism or Christianity or Islam, I mean, these are all religions that were founded within very patriarchal societies, right? Now, usually, I mean, we could get into a whole discussion of things like what I think many Muslim feminists would say was that, like, things like Islam, while they are founded in highly patriarchal cultures, in the religion themselves, you see things which are reformations of that patriarchy on behalf of the status of women, for example, right? But so the point is, though, that I think that there's an interesting, so you can obviously talk. Well, another thing about gender and kinship relationships as well is they're really, really tricky to talk about until you get something like written texts, right? Or, I mean, maybe you can do things, I mean, obviously many, art historians and other people do great things, but with material culture. But gender is to me, I mean, is an extremely difficult thing to figure out from material culture. So that's also a reason why, you can sort of start to talk, you can sort of tell an interesting story about gender from kind of the early modern period onward, and much harder earlier. So,
why are we still, anxious about defining Southeast Asia, right? I mean,
yeah. Well, I'm not, but yeah, yeah.
Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia.
Right.
It's really society from governments that define Southeast Asia to get funds to. In the university, we have the Southeast Asia program, so what we're studying.
Yeah.
I think it's time that we just forget about Southeast Asia and then focus on whatever we want to study, right?
True, yeah.
Because that's how you define what you're doing is studying, a certain topic, and you can go beyond Southeast Asia.
Right.
So that's why I'm saying that, why are we still so anxious about defining it, trying to find something common? So trying to define its borders and so on.
Right. Right.
I think as scholars, we should just quit that and just study whatever you want to study.
Right. 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 No, I agree. I mean, so on the one hand, in a certain kind of ideal world, I strongly agree with you, right? And even beyond that, I think that. So let me just sort of say, like, why are we anxious? I mean, whether or not. So like I said, I'm not anxious about it. I think that, like, it's fun as long as we, in the world, we think about the world as, you know, we have these sort of ideas of regions of the world and so forth, right? So those do tend to shape our thinking about things. One of the problems, and one of the things I would love for, I mean, if this book has any effect in doing so, a thing I would like to see just in Southeast Asia is more opportunities for more people to do something outside of their own country, right? Or of their own part of the world or their own culture or whatever, right? In fact, I was on, somebody contacted me to talk, partially because of this book, some strategic, and it was like Singapore Center for Strategic Futures or something. They were like trying to like think about Southeast Asia and Singapore's place in Southeast Asia. And they were asking me for, like, do I know experts at various places in Southeast Asia, whether in Thailand or Indonesia? And I could name a few, but there's actually, I mean, what they were saying was they were trying to look for people within the region who kind of knew about, had sort of a regional perspective. And it's very, very, very hard to find that there's a lot of sort of national. So everywhere, at any moment in time, our thinking is going to be shaped by the kinds of frames of reference we have. So I would say right now, you know, the national frame of reference is just an overwhelming one. And so that this is written a little bit in contradiction to that. And the other problem, and what I think, hopefully this book will have some information, but also inspire and allow people within the region, when they're thinking about whatever the topic is, if it's gender, if it's economics, if it's, you know, identity, to be able to think in comparative terms with other Southeast Asian societies, right, as a productive way of thinking. Without that, and this is where I can speak to, see, the problem is, if you don't, one of the things is, I think if you just eliminate, like if you eliminated area studies, which of course many people want to do, right? If you eliminate area studies, then you'll get a situation like what I find in gender studies, which is like 95% of all the discourse is about the United States, right? And so as a gender studies scholar, it's like incredibly frustrating to like see everything sort of shuttled through a lens of North America or maybe Europe. So I think that, anyway, I think there are sort of reasons like that for promoting, you know, at least in, say, in the North American context, like promoting area studies, for example, just to try to get out of that. And within Southeast Asia, I think promoting more thinking about the region so people don't get trapped in certain niches that they get trapped in, like the national niche being one of them. But I think it's a legitimate, very legitimate sort of question. Yeah. So, right.
I could ask a
Yeah,
question. So
sure.
I'm not sure, because I was looking at the slides for all the time, and then I was wondering, where does that picture come from?
Oh, that's in Bali. That's Bali. Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah.
Because there's that part of the book, and then I wonder, because they talk about modernity, you talk about industrial technology,
Yeah.
it's like part of it.
Yeah.
But I feel like right now there are books already on technology, but sometimes I feel like there is a rupture in between, because we talk about how agriculture applied technology, how irrigation project was conducted, and then water dam, but it's kind of like there is very classical technology, but then there is also very modern technology. But then somehow in between, there is kind of like a rupture, like nothing happened on developing. So I was wondering, like, what is the role of technology?
Yeah, so I don't. So you're very correct in that I don't, for example, have a chapter dedicated to technology per se, but there is discussion of important technologies throughout the book. I would say in terms of like actually the chapter on modernity, I spend a reason. I mean, I have one or two sections, maybe three. Anyway, talking about like print, the public sphere, cinema, radio, television, media technologies, right? And the ways in which those are very important to sort of shaping modern populations and modern sensibilities. So there's that part in technology, and then there's actually in the second chapter, I think it is first chapter, second chapter, early chapter, I talk about. Well, I start talking about technology, talking about Stone Age innovation, right? And the way that people created, I mean, people came up, somebody somewhere, or some group somewhere, we don't know where, came up with sumatroliths, right? Which are the certain kinds of stone technology, right? And so there is definitely like an agricultural technology, wet rice growing technology, et cetera, right? So, and I don't, I've mentioned in passing things like transportation technology. Actually, I spend a lot of time talking about Malay sailing technology. So that was so there's a lot, there's actually, I can point to many things about technology in the book, but I don't sort of put it all together as technology as one chapter, yeah, sure.